Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Dementia Journal Club. This is the first time we've attempted to broadcast online, so I hope you like it and it adds value for whatever you're studying. So the title of the talk today is Challenges with Alzheimer's Research and Care. We'll start out by defining Alzheimer's disease and looking at some of the signs of Alzheimer's disease. We'll then look at what causes Alzheimer's disease, or at least potentially what causes it. There are several different hypotheses. We'll look a little bit at how Alzheimer's disease is different regionally. And then we'll jump into some of the challenges that we currently face with Alzheimer's disease research. We'll continue looking at challenges, and we'll focus on challenges with Alzheimer's disease care. We'll look at some examples from my research in my laboratory. And finally, we'll conclude with what's new with Alzheimer's disease research overall. So what is Alzheimer's disease? Well, we should first say that Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia, and dementia is an umbrella term. So there are actually many different types of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. There's also Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's dementia, and so on. Some of these forms have memory loss associated with their signs, and others don't. So it just depends. You can see here there are several different signs for dementia in general. The idea of dementia was originally defined as madness or without mind, which is an unfortunate definition since it does carry a stigma with it. Nowadays, in the new Diagnostic and Statistical Manual number 5, healthcare professionals have tried to reterm the definition of dementia, where they call it a major neurocognitive disorder, with healthcare practitioners and the public alike continue to use the term dementia. There certainly is a stigma attached with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. There's the perception of self, the self-stigma. There's the public stigma, or how others treat and think of those with dementia. And then there's the population as a whole. It's interesting to look at some of the perceptions held by healthcare practitioners throughout the world. And in North America, we probably wouldn't believe that this is the case, but there certainly is a stigma associated with Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. So for example, looking at this graph, if we look at the figure on the left, this illustrates the people with dementia perceived as dangerous, and this is a perception by healthcare practitioners. The axis on the bottom shows that as it continues to the right, it's indicating the percentage. So in some countries, we can see that actually a very high percentage of healthcare practitioners will view dementia patients as being dangerous. Likewise, in another associated graph on the right, the question's asked, would I make an effort to keep my dementia a secret when meeting people if I had dementia myself? And some healthcare practitioners in different parts of the world have a much higher percentage, and so they would keep it a secret. These are all different lines of evidence for showing that there certainly is a stigma, not only by the general public, but also by healthcare practitioners. So what causes Alzheimer's disease? Well, aging is the greatest risk factor, but we know that Alzheimer's disease is actually multifactorial. And what we mean by that is that there are probably several different causes. In fact, some people, including in my view, have thought that there's at least 30 different important mechanisms or processes that can contribute to Alzheimer's disease. The most popular mechanisms that have been studied are amyloid plaques, the sticky toxic proteins, and also tangles. Tangles are important because they disrupt an organelle in the cell called the microtubules. And the microtubules in our cells are like highways or interstate systems that transport cargo. When these transport systems are disrupted, the cell cannot function normally. So one of the leading hypotheses over the years for a potential cause of Alzheimer's disease has been the so-called cholinergic hypothesis. And this hypothesis states that there's a deficit in acetylcholine neurotransmission, a type of neurotransmitter. And if we can enhance that neurotransmitter, we might be able to improve different conditions and signs associated with Alzheimer's disease. One important role for cholinergic transmission is in intentional processing. The other leading hypothesis for Alzheimer's disease over the years has been the amyloid beta hypothesis. And in this hypothesis, it's thought that an accumulation of toxic A beta in the brain is really the primary influence for driving Alzheimer's disease pathogenesis. Scientists and physicians over the years then, in reacting to this hypothesis, have tried to either block A beta or clear A beta or interfere with the mechanisms that produce amyloid beta in order to resolve the symptoms and signs of Alzheimer's disease. What's the current status of Alzheimer's disease regionally? Well, in fact, one new case of Alzheimer's disease, or I should say in dementia in general, is diagnosed every 3 seconds throughout the world. Most likely this number will double every 20 years. If we look at this figure, we see the regional distribution of Alzheimer's disease and dementia throughout the world. We can see that in North America and South America, there's a 248% increase. And currently there's about 9 million cases of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias in North, Central, and South America. We can see similar, very alarming increases in other regions of the world, like Southeast Asia, with a 226% increase in the number of cases of dementia. So what are some of the challenges with Alzheimer's disease care? Well, I want to use an example of my mom who developed dementia. This is my mom showing a photograph of her when she was younger, when she was about 21, and then another photograph of her in a rest home when she was about 93. This is about a year or so before she died. So what were some of the challenges that we experienced as a family with my mom in contracting dementia? So at first we saw repetitive speech. She was in an assisted living facility at this time, and we did notice that she would repeat herself, and sometimes she would catch herself doing this and other times she didn't. She started developing other sorts of memory problems, losing her keys, forgetting different daily tasks and that sort of thing. We also started noticing other behaviors that were more troublesome, like hoarding food in her dresser. And we also started noticing that she had some really awkward and dysfunctional interactions with healthcare staff and some of the other residents. And in some cases, it actually became aggressive, which was very unfortunate. It was interesting to deal with the healthcare aides and rest home directors, because I did notice that they also had a stigma in the way they treated my mom. In fact, they even encouraged me and my kids not to visit anymore. We also noticed a general sense of impatience and increased agitation with my mom as the disease got worse. But now at one point, my mom developed congestive heart failure and she had to be hospitalized, and she was in the hospital for a week and a half. And after getting out of the hospital, it was at this point in time that she was actually diagnosed with profound dementia. And it was very curious, because it was at this point in time that there was a very rapid acceleration of her symptoms. And so she couldn't hold a conversation anymore. She didn't know my name. She called me Spencer, and there's no Spencer in my family. So she really didn't know who I was anymore, and her ability to speak and interact was very limited after the congestive heart failure. She also began falling out of bed regularly, which became a more serious issue, and she started to bruise, and we noticed a lot of different bruises. Fortunately, she never broke any bones, but she started falling out of bed almost on a daily basis. Given that she had agitation, we tried music therapy, and we did see some improvement in her mood sometimes, but occasionally she was chemically sedated. So that was our experience, but what are some of the other experiences that other people have found with Alzheimer's behaviors? And this is a listing of some of the challenging Alzheimer's behaviors other people have experienced, and they're ranked here in the order of frequency. So agitation or aggression seems to be the most common behavior that's noticed in Alzheimer's disease, according to this study. This was conducted by the Center to Advance Palliative Care, and the reference is below for this. The next most frequent behavior was repetitive speech, as we saw in my mom, and then there were several others like wandering, incontinence, confusion, sleeplessness, refusal to eat, paranoia, non-compliance or refusal to take medicine, in some cases hallucinations, and refusal to bathe, and so on. So it's interesting to talk a little bit more about agitation and aggression, and one has to wonder what is the current treatment. So actually the progress in treatment options have been very limited for treating agitation and aggression in Alzheimer's disease, partly by a lack of a clear definition. A new working group was created not too long ago that defined 3 types of agitation, and they were defined as excessive motor activity, verbal aggression, or physical aggression. So now some rest homes or personal care homes have tried music therapy to treat aggressive behaviors. But however, once these become more serious and if people are hurt, then really the last resort in many situations is that antipsychotic agents are used to cause sedation. Not the best choice, but really the only choice that we have with some individuals. So what are some of the biggest caregiver challenges that we find in Alzheimer's disease and other dementia? Well, dealing with the memory loss and the impact of the disease on individuals, it seems to be the leading and most frequent challenge that most caregivers identify. Also, handling the stress and emotional toll on themselves. Many caregivers will get burnt out, and which makes them more susceptible for a variety of diseases themselves. Having patience with their family member seems to be very trying at times. And also dealing with one's mood swings or behavioral changes rates fairly high. And you can see some of the other frequent behaviors and challenges here as well. Changes in daily activities, keeping a positive and motivated attitude, problems with maintaining finances and other bills, administering medications, which we talked about a bit before, and then speaking with one's healthcare providers. And finally, scheduling appointments and overall time management. So these are an overall ranking of some of the biggest caregiver challenges. Some other challenges that have been highlighted by the Alzheimer's Association include a lack of public knowledge. Many people throughout the world still don't realize all the facts associated with Alzheimer's and other related dementias. They're not fully aware of the difference between Alzheimer's disease and aging, for example. There's still problems in detecting and diagnosing the disease accurately. We still have a poor standard of care for dementia care throughout North America that needs to be improved. And there are specific challenges faced by diverse communities, especially with Hispanics and Blacks in the United States, or by Aboriginal communities, more so in Canada. So these are some specific racial and ethnic challenges that are underrepresented in terms of clinical evidence that needs to be addressed. There's also challenges faced by those with so-called younger onset Alzheimer's. So this is the type when people have the onset of Alzheimer's before the age of 60. And there are other types of dementia too that actually affect those that are younger. Also, unprepared caregivers. Caregivers aren't trained in many cases. They receive any information they need kind of on the spot. So there's a lot of work to do with giving support, not just emotional support, but better information to caregivers as they have to deal with their family members with dementia. And there's also ill-equipped communities. There's an initiative in several countries now called Dementia-Friendly Communities that helps to improve the quality of the way we interact with those with dementia in our community. And it's a way of educating and training just a variety of people in the community, and a grocery store, at the post office, and so on, so that we can help those with dementia as we witness them struggle with trying to identify what food to buy, or problems with making change and this sort of thing. And so dementia-friendly communities is a great initiative, but there's still a lot of work to be done with bringing this to work properly in our various communities across different countries. And finally, the mounting costs of care. There's really an exponential growth in the number of new cases of Alzheimer's and other types of dementia. And because of that, we have exponential growth in the amount of costs associated with care as well. So what are some of the challenges with Alzheimer's disease research? Well, here's an interesting figure. This is 2010, but it hasn't changed very much. And what we're looking at are the leading causes of death, including Alzheimer's, which is the sixth leading cause of death, but we're comparing it to other leading causes of death, such as stroke and different types of cancer, heart disease, and HIV. And what we find is that we're actually have made great progress with reducing the other types of causes of death. You can see that they're all on the decrease, except for Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease continues to increase, but we don't see that with the other types of causes of death. Also, if we compare Alzheimer's disease research funding with other major chronic diseases like cancer or HIV or heart disease, you can see that Alzheimer's disease research pales by comparison in the amount of money at the NIH and in other countries that have been allocated towards Alzheimer's disease research. Over the last 3 years in the United States, this has changed a bit. And we have seen some very significant increases in Alzheimer's disease research and the amount of money that's been dedicated to that effort, but it still really is way behind other areas like cancer therapies and cancer research and heart research, et cetera. So what are the drugs that are used for Alzheimer's disease, and what are the approved drugs? And well, there's really only 5 drugs that are listed here. Aricept and Exelon are 2 very well-used examples. In fact, there's really only 4 drugs, because the 5th drug is actually a combination of 2 in the list. The last drug for Alzheimer's disease that was approved was in 2003. So we haven't had any new FDA-approved drugs for many years. The problem, of course, is that all of these drugs show only modest benefit, and only in some specialized populations. So this is shows some of the drugs that are in different phases in clinical trials, and there are hundreds actually that are in the pipeline. Most of these are focused on targeting amyloid beta, and in that case, they're trying to clear or block amyloid beta. And there are other drugs that are being tested to modulate cholinergic processes. However, most of the drugs that have been tested so far have actually failed in clinical trials. So over 99% of Alzheimer's disease drugs have actually failed that have targeted amyloid beta or cholinergic mechanisms. However, there is one other drug that got a lot of media attention this year. That's aducanumab. And in March of 2019, Biogen and Eisai announced they would terminate their trials, the eMERGE trial and the ENGAGE trial, because of a futility analysis that was conducted. However, in October, the drug got resurrected, and another analysis showed that in the eMERGE trial that the drug actually met its primary endpoint. And this occurred because there was another look at the data, and where they evaluated patients that had taken a higher dose, that at 10 milligrams per kilogram, and they saw in this case a significant reduction in decline in the primary endpoint. The group also found that there was a decline in secondary endpoints in other tests. So Biogen announced plans to apply for regulatory approval in the US in 2020. And the company also asked eligible patients from these trials, the Emerge, Engage, and Prime trials, to actually return for renewed dosing and observation. So I'm going to talk a little bit more now about some of the research we're doing in my laboratory. This includes looking at sex-based differences in Alzheimer's disease. I received a large federal grant last year to look at mechanisms associated with sex differences. And in particular, we've been looking at mitochondrial dysfunction in our transgenic mice that have been genetically engineered to show some of the similarities that humans see in Alzheimer's disease. And what we found overall in our pilot data the last 3 or 4 years is that we see huge differences between males and females in the way mitochondria become dysfunctional. In fact, we see that mitochondria become dysfunctional in our female transgenic mice very early in the disease process, as early as 2 months. But we don't see the significant change in mitochondrial function in males until much later, closer to 6 months. So this is the figure on the left shows some of the PET scanning that we've been doing in these mice. And the blue areas are regions of hypometabolism. So these are areas where glucose uptake is actually reduced. And so these are areas then we start looking at in our studies, where we obtain samples and we can do more work looking at mitochondrial function and how mitochondria might become dysfunctional. In some of the other work we're doing, we're looking at an anti-cancer drug called nilotinib for treating Alzheimer's. Our collaborators at Georgetown University, in particular Dr. Scott Turner, has been working with this drug in his memory clinic and treating patients with Alzheimer's disease. And so in our collaboration and in my laboratory, we've been looking at this drug in our mouse models to see if it has any functional activity against the mitochondria. And so far, we have found that at certain doses, nilotinib can improve mitochondrial function, which might provide an explanation for nilotinib as an effective therapy in Alzheimer's disease. The other study that we're doing is a clinical trial, and this is based on evidence from our research center. The St. Boniface Hospital Research Center has been looking at flaxseed for treating and improving heart health for many years. Dr. Grant Pierce is leading the charge. He's the executive director at St. Boniface Research, and he has provided lots of good data and has published many high-impact papers on looking at flaxseed and how it improves heart health, in particular in reducing blood pressure. So based on this work, we decided to look at its potential effect in brain health. And so we have applied for funding, which we received, to look at a flaxseed diet to see if it can improve memory in Alzheimer's disease patients. And so we've gotten funding and we received approval from Health Canada to start a clinical trial. We haven't begun the recruitment process yet, but we will once the pandemic is over. And here's an outline of our clinical trial design that we'll have about 60 patients. Some of these patients will get PET scanning. We'll look at how glucose uptake might change. And then in half of these patients, so an N of 30, will receive the flax beverage on a daily basis, about 30 grams per day. And then the other half will receive a placebo. And we'll do a variety of different memory tests to before and after to see if a flaxseed beverage daily consumption can improve memory in our memory tests. So what else is new with Alzheimer's disease research? Well, there are a variety of things. Some of the meetings I've been going to is quite exciting to see what's been showing up. There's certainly improvements in blood testing and other types of diagnostic testing for Alzheimer's disease with better accuracy, the ability to discriminate amongst different types of dementia, and to also to look at Alzheimer's disease and detect it earlier in some of these blood tests. Also, there's emerging new types of therapies like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, or DBS, deep brain stimulation, that are being used in different neurological disorders, including Alzheimer's disease. And in some cases, this has shown improvement in memory. Also, the idea of infectious disease as a causative agent for Alzheimer's disease is being more seriously considered these days. In particular, the herpes virus is one of the agents that people are looking at to see if it can be a factor in causing Alzheimer's disease. And a variety of different drug combinations are being tested in an age-dependent way to see if this can improve efficacy for those with Alzheimer's disease. Also, we've seen an increase in the use of artificial intelligence in clinical trials. In some cases, this includes using AI for control groups, and in other cases, it's being used to help improve with the looking at particular populations to find different specialized populations that might be better suited for different types of treatments. Also, there's a lot of improvements in screening and trying to figure out, especially with regard to sex, and who's at risk and who might benefit more from certain types of treatments. And we're also still looking at genetic risk factors like ApoE, but there are other new genes that are being evaluated as well. There's also a lot of activity with inflammation. And there, of course, there's more than one type of cell in the brain. There are neurons and glia. And glia, there's several subtypes, including microglia and astrocytes. And the inflammatory process involves these glial cells. And there's been a lot of recent work on looking at inflammation in general and specific types of cells like microglia to see what their role is in causing inflammation in the brain, and that's associated with Alzheimer's disease. And also there's been a lot of work looking at brain resilience. How can we prevent Alzheimer's disease by making our brains more resilient, especially with diet and exercise? And our lab, of course, is working on the flaxseed diet. That's why I highlight it in yellow here. And then our lab, along with other labs throughout the world, are looking at using different methods to look at brain metabolism, and in particular, looking at the role that mitochondria play and how they might become dysfunctional in different types of dementia, and other different methods and new ideas as well. So what are some of the 5 things we learned in 2019 about Alzheimer's disease? Well, we learned that blood tests can be predictive. Up to 88% accuracy has been achieved in some studies. We also have found that lifestyle matters and that lowering blood pressure significantly reduces the risk for MCI, or mild cognitive impairment. We also have become more aware that sensory impairments in older adults may increase risk, which is something we have to look at more seriously. And our work, along with other labs, have shown that sex-based differences exist in Alzheimer's, which means that our treatments probably need to be tailored more specifically for men versus women in order to be more effective. And as of 2019, more than 500 new potential drug targets have been identified. So there are a lot of new drugs that are being evaluated. So perhaps a new treatment is right around the corner with some of these new drug candidates. So I want to thank the members of my lab for showing and helping generate some of the data that we have in this slide presentation today. In particular, some of the project leaders in the work I showed you include Drs. Wanda Snow, Yelena Dvorževic, and Ida Limbagodam. I also want to thank my funding sources: the Canadian Agricultural Partnership funds my clinical trial, the CIHR grant from the Canadian government funds my sex-based differences in Alzheimer's disease research. And here are some links for more information. Thank you.